Hi crafters, to celebrate the release of some new textures stencils and the re-release of the alphabet stencils, I have got a video jam-packed with 30 stencil techniques for you. Everything you could possibly do with a stencil in your craft room. Now, none of these are using any specific materials that you're going to have to go out and buy, so hopefully a lot of the things you've already got, and this is going to open up a whole new world of crafting techniques for you. So let's get started with more simple techniques and then we'll move on to some more complex ones as we work through the video. So first of all, reverse imprinting. So literally using your stencil a bit like a stamp. So you can put any sort of water reactive ink onto the back of your stencil. I like to do this quite lightly, so I'm just brushing it over, and it's best if this is done with a bold design. And then give that a little light mist. Now you don't want too much water because that will just run everywhere. As you can see, I've done this on a mat that I can wipe clean afterwards. And then simply just press that down into your cardstock. So the cardstock is ideally going to be nice and smooth, so you don't have any texture to deal with. And I like to put a piece of kitchen towel over the top. This is going to absorb any excess that just leaks out of the sides. Now, of course, you can also repeat this because this is not going to be a perfect image. This is going to be quite distressed, but it does leave a beautiful finished result. Now this is something I like to do every time I've used my stencil, whether it's with ink or with spritzes. I water down a little bit of the excess on the stencil and then press it into some paper and just see what the finished result is. Sometimes I keep it, sometimes I don't, but it's great to avoid any waste. If you have a gel plate or a jelly plate, you can also use your stencils. There's some brilliant techniques with this. You can press into the ink, you can lift the ink up. Now, usually what would happen is I would be using paint, but you can equally use inks as well, just the same way. I'm just going to brayer these out in the same way as I usually would. Drop a stencil into the ink, and as you can see there, and you can absolutely go over the top for that pressure if you want. You'll have to wash your stencil afterwards. You can see that has lifted up lots of the ink. Make sure there's no air bubbles under there. We carefully lift off our stencil, place a piece of cardstock down over the top. Just give that a really good burnish with your hands or with a clean brayer, and then peel off to reveal the beautiful pattern that you can see in there. Isn't that just so pretty? And usually you can do this a couple of times. The second time is definitely going to be a lot more subtle, but it's well worth trying to see what effect you get. You can see there I've got a much paler version, very pretty, very watercolor-like. And that stencil, now that the gel plate is clean, I'm just going to do exactly as we just did. I'm going to spritz that with water because the excess ink is on there. I'm going to just lay this panel of cardstock down on top and lift up the excess again, just to make sure we're not losing any ink and we're making the very most of it. And there's another impression that's not as clear, of course, but if you wanted to go in with your stencil and draw around the edges, you could pick out that detail instead. Now, in your die cutting machine, you're going to want a rubber mat or an embossing mat. Then you want to place your paper or cardstock down, and then a stencil with quite large areas on top. Now, what's going to happen when you run this through is the embossing mat is going to push the cardstock or paper through the stencil with the pressure. So you might need to play with the pressure in your machine and work out which way works best for you. I'm going to just set this for now at general die cutting, run it through and see how I feel about it. If it rips or tears the cardstock, then you're going to need to lighten the pressure. If you don't get an impression, of course, you're going to need to add more. That feels pretty good just on the normal die cutting setting. Let's take a look and see. That is absolutely beautiful. That's perfect. Let me just release that and show you that emboss. Isn't that gorgeous? And you can literally do that with virtually any stencil as long as the design is large enough for the cardstock or paper to be pushed through. And then don't forget, of course, you can also lay your stencil over the top of the embossing, so just like so. Let's move the die cutting machine out of the way. And you can take some ink and you can brush that through onto just the raised designs, which just highlights them even more. Look at that, absolutely gorgeous. And it's not only cardstock you can do this with, you can also do it with vellum or parchment. It looks absolutely beautiful. Now for this, you do need to lighten the pressure a little bit more. So let's just put our sandwich together in the same way. You can tape down with a low tack tape if you want to. And I'm just going to lift that pressure off a little bit with this machine because I can do that and run this through. Now you might hear some creaking and cracking a little. You don't want too much of that because you don't want the parchment to actually crack all the way through and break. So like I say, it might take a bit of experimenting with your particular machine and your plates. Let's take a look at this. Look at that, absolutely beautiful, so pretty. Again, if you want to pick that out with ink by using the stencil over the top, you can do. You can use either side as well. This has like dipped down areas. You can brush embossing ink over the top of the raised areas, use embossing powder over. There's lots of ideas that you can be doing with that. It's absolutely beautiful, and of course you've got that translucency as well. Very pretty. Now once more I am going to show you the same technique again, but this time I'm going to be doing it with mirror card, and the reason being is because there's such a fun technique that you can do with embossed mirror card afterwards. Now usually I would do this with embossing folders, but just to show you it's absolutely possible and equally as beautiful if you do this with mirror card and stencils. So again, running through a stencil that's got quite a deep design in it and nice big areas. Just pull that away, take a look at that, absolutely stunning, so pretty. And for this we're going to get a little bit messy now. It's very much worth it if you like a faux metal look, and I'm going to put paint all over the entire surface of this embossed mirror card. I'm going to use a soft brush just to brush into the detail, make sure I get it everywhere I want it. You want to either leave this to air dry for a few minutes or use your heat tool just to dry off the surface. Doesn't need to be thoroughly dry. Once that's dry, I take a piece of fine grit sandpaper. Sorry if you don't like the noise. I know my daughter hates the noise of sandpaper. Maybe turn the volume down. I'll try to do that on the video anyway. And just gently rub off the paint off the raised surface. As you can see, you start to get a faux metal look, very aged, tarnished metal look that looks really cool, but that raised design has started coming through. So the next technique is using a resist. So I'm going to first of all ink blend onto my panel with some nice deep dark colours. This does work best if your colours are quite dark. Now you need to ensure that your background is completely dry, otherwise the next stage will be completely ruined. So you need to dry this off, air dry it, whatever it may be, and if you need to, test it with some clear embossing powder just over the top to make sure that it's not sticking anywhere on the panel. As you can see, that is still wet, although it feels completely dry. So all I do is tap off as much of this as possible. You can also brush it off and then continue drying until that powder no longer sticks. Once you're happy that that is completely dry, we can now stick a stencil over the top. I like to use low tack tape for this just to hold it still for a moment. I'm going to put the design in the center, and I'm going to use a blending brush, and I keep this one purely for clear ink, and some Versamark, so clear embossing ink as well. Now you don't want too much of this on your brush because you don't want it to seep under the design. So just brushing over this, and actually quite lightly. So going around in circles as well to capture all the detail. Sometimes holding it up to the light, you can see the shine and you'll be able to see where you've gone. But otherwise, you just have to hope for the best. So taking that off now, if I do that, hopefully you can see that shine there. Beautiful. And this is why you needed your ink to be fully dry before you did this, so that the powder only stuck to those florals. Anywhere else, and you can just use your soft brush again. So these edges, obviously I caught with embossing ink, that's understandable. As the powder heat sets, of course, it's going to go clear. Now that alone is a beautiful technique if you want something really subtle, but my favourite thing to do now, once that has all cooled and of course it's all dry, is to spritz this with water, just like so. Now I'm also going to take a piece of cardstock and lift this up just to make sure that I'm not missing the opportunity to get a really pretty print. Sometimes it comes out nicely, sometimes it doesn't, but it's worth it because you're only going to absorb it up with a kitchen towel anyway. So lift that up, and we've just got a nice watercolour wash there, so that's fine. But we are going to dab up all of this excess ink and then repeat again. So lift up as much of that ink as possible. It actually looks really, really pretty when you've got the water on there because it's kind of glossy. And then again, start lifting up that excess ink. So we're whitewashing or water washing the ink, but if you notice underneath the embossing, the ink colour has remained nice and dark and deep. So once you cut around the edges, you've got a really, really pretty kind of ombre effect, but you've got the darker design where the embossing is. Now this next technique is one that I learned from Gina K and I absolutely love it. It's a drop shadow technique. I'm actually going to be sticking my stencil all the way down for this one. So again, I'm going to use the Damask stencil from the new set. I'm using a repositionable spray glue because I've recently re-inked my white ink and I don't want it to squelch through the edges and spread where it shouldn't. So a light mist of the repositionable spray over the back of the stencil. And just give that a few moments to dry. You want to do that in a room with lots of ventilation. Don't forget that. I'm going to place this there. I'm also going to place a little bit of tape over the hole at the top because I don't need that inking. Pushing that down. Then I'm going to go in with my white ink and I'm going to be very careful about not putting too much on. So there's quite a lot in this ink pad at the moment. It's very juicy. You want to use a pigment ink. That is really important, that it is a pigment ink. If it's not, if it's a dye ink, for example, it's just going to fade into your cardstock and you're not going to see the colour. The pigment ink, the white pigment, will stay sat on top and it'll be nice and visible even when it dries. There we go, that's lovely, perfect. I've got a bit of glue there. I will leave that to dry and I will wipe that away later. I've got a glue applicator, a glue remover. A glue remover tool I can take that off with. Place this down again. Now this time we're going to find the centre where it was and we're going to move it slightly down and slightly to the left. Now you can do this anyway, it depends where you want the light to hit your design. So we're only going to go a few millimetres either way. So I think there looks pretty good. Stick it again and this time we are going to go over the top with a colour that's a slightly darker but similar to the colour that you've got as your base colour. So you don't have to do this on craft. Whatever colour you do it on, obviously white won't work, but you want to use a similar colour but slightly darker. So that's what I'm doing with the frayed burlap here, and make sure you're happy. Now for me, I can just see that, but it's not quite dark enough, so I think I'm going to switch to a slightly, just very slightly darker brown. As I say, you can do this on another colour cardstock, so whether it's blue, red, pink, purple, green, whatever. I like to do it on craft, it's got a nice natural feel, but yeah, as long as you've got the bright white, you can go on any other colour. Just lift up the corner and while it's in place, ensure you're happy with the design. I like that. Okay, so let's have a reveal. Look at that. Like I say, the glue does need to be removed. I've got a glue remover eraser that I can rub over that in a moment. But isn't that just such a pretty design? Now the next one is really simple, but it's worth remembering, particularly if you do an inky technique with your stencils and the detail's not quite as clear as you'd like it. This might help pick it out. So using a pen and just simply going around the stencil design. So I've got letters here, so these obviously have gaps in. There we go. And then if I want to use that as a template for maybe doing some colouring in, or if I want to take the nice stencil over the top and then do some inking as well and have the outline, I can do that. Now something else you can also do is stamp through your design. Now whether or not you choose to ink through it first is entirely up to you. So for example, I'm going to ink, let's do Twisted Citron, a nice bright colour, and just go through this A. These are the alphabet stencils which have just been re-released. You'll find them again linked down below. So these are really nice and bright. In fact, let's also blend this in with a bit of sour patina, get a bit of an ombre going on. And then choose yourself a stamp. Now this is a stamp set that's also just been re-released along with the stencils. So I've got script in here, I have got some nice fonts in there. Let's use these letters. my stamp into the ink, and I prefer to do this without a block. If you do it with a block, the stamp isn't necessarily going to reach the cardstock underneath. It will stop at the level of the stencil, whereas if you use your fingers, let's just put a bit more ink on there because of the size of the letter. Make sure that all the areas of the stencil get covered. There we go. Lay that down. You can use your fingers just to press in where needed through the stencil. Make sure your stencil is taped into place and hasn't moved since you inked it. Lift that up, and if I remove this, we have got a cool letter with stamping inside. This could be script, it could be polka dots, anything you want, but there's another way of using your stencils. Alongside stamping through your stencil, you can also do stenciling through your stencil. So the double stencil technique is really easy. What you ideally want is a nice bold image underneath, something with some really large areas, just like this. So I'm using the alphabet again. I'm going to use the letter H. These alphabet stencils are perfect for writing someone's name or a word that maybe you don't usually find in die or stamp form. Then I'm going to take, let's use the darker colour, the Villainous Potion, and I'm going to find another stencil. So let's go with the Damask. Pop that over the top. Make sure nothing's moving. Use the brush, not too much ink because you want to just brush over the surface lightly, and going in all directions again. Like I say, lightly with not too much ink. It's better to build it up because you don't want ink getting in and seeping through your stencils. Holding everything still, being sure that nothing moves. And just brushing that second colour through. It's ideal if the second colour is actually just a little bit darker, so it really shows up. And then there we go. We now have another technique doing double effect using your stencils. Now for this next one, I'm going to use my spray again, just lightly, because I'm going to be using pastes and they could seep through. I'm using the you can either call it Starburst or a Sunburst stencil for this one. I'm also going to be using the Colorology mixing paste. Now at the moment, the Colorology items that I'm going to be using are all 40% off on Craft Stash. I'll make sure there's another link in the description for that. Now I don't need a lot of paste here, so I'm just going to put 2 small piles there. And then I'm going to use the Colorology mixing powders. Now we're going to create a kind of ombre look. We're going to mix these powders in with the paste to give us a really lovely vivid paste. Look absolutely beautiful. Now you may have pastes that are coloured already and you can absolutely use those for this technique. I like to make my own. So that one is the teal and this one is magenta. Since I've just mixed up the magenta, I'm going to start with this and I'm going to apply this around the outside of my stencil. And you want to kind of section your stencil off to create an ombre look. So I'm sort of, like I say, focusing on the outside, but you don't need to be precise with it. It should look like quite a natural fade from one colour to another. And go in with the second colour from the centre out. So now all the spaces are filled. I've got 2 very defined areas there. I'm just going to mix on my mat a little bit of the 2 colours, which should give me a kind of purple colour. And with this, I'm going to just run round the centre a little bit, just blending those 2 a touch, not too much. I mean, most of the holes are already filled. It's just going to help with that lovely blend so you don't get too much of a defined 2-colour finish. And then we can lift off our stencil. You don't need to wait for it to dry. You're better off doing it while the paste is still wet. If you can get your fingers underneath there. There we go, absolutely beautiful. If I hold this up, you can see we go from the hot pink on the outside to the purple and then into the teal in the middle. So this next technique I'm going to be doing onto cardstock with some oxide inks. These could also be your inks, your general distress inks. They don't have to be oxides. I like to use oxides because I like the chalky pigment of them. That's just my preference, but all of the techniques using the oxides will also work with the inks as well. So I'm going to use a large stencil here that has got some nice big designs in it. So the Harlequin pattern is really nice and bold. And just pop that there. I might use a bit, I haven't got a lot of sticky on my mat at the moment because there's a lot of ink on there, so I'm going to use a bit of tape, hopefully hold that still. And then we need to take a wet wipe. I prefer to use a cloth wet wipe than a piece of kitchen towel or tissue that's been watered down, because they tend to leave little bits all over the design, whereas a wet wipe tends to hold its own while it's wet. And all we're going to do is gently just wipe away the colour from between the stencil. This is a lovely subtle technique. It's absolutely perfect for a background. So keep working at it. You don't want to rub hard because you don't want to pill the cardstock underneath. We're just lifting the ink. So just by applying the water, that will already lighten that ink a little. And too much action will, like I say, it will start to get into the paper and pull it, especially while it's damp. So you don't want that. So you just want to lightly start lifting up the colour. There we go. I think that's probably enough. Let's just lift that up and have a look. And you can see we have got a beautiful design. Now, some of the water from the wet wipe seeped underneath the stencil, so we've actually got more of a water white effect around each of the diamonds. But just look, that is so pretty. Another way to create fun effects is to mask off some of the area but underneath your stencil. So for this, you don't want to use tape because that will also do some masking. So I'm going to use the repositionable adhesive again, just a tiny bit on a scrap of cardstock that is cut to the shape of whatever I want to have the mask as. So a tiny little bit of spritz on the back just to hold that in place. Then I'm going to place my stencil over the top of the design. I might do it that way. It's only just going to reach the very edges, so it's going to be quite, again, a subtle design. And I'm going to ink through the stencil around these edges. That will leave me with a really nice, crisp design edge. So I've got the aperture in the middle. That will be nice and sharp at the edges. And then removing it, and you've got yourself a really nice clear frame. Now, blending out a design is also really easy. So I'm going to place this damask diamond in the corner of my cardstock. I'm going to have ink on my brush, but I'm not going to reapply it at all. So I've just dabbed it into my ink once. This is Seedless Preserves. And I'm going to go through into the edge of my design quite dark and keep going over and over. And then gradually work my way out of the design, lightening the pressure as I go, but also, as I say, not reapplying the ink. So then when I lift that off, we've got a beautiful faded out design. We can do this up in this top corner as well. So I'll just do one little dab of ink, just enough to get us started, and then gently lighten that pressure until we literally blend out to nothing. Now you can also run gilding wax through your stencils. So I've got a palette knife here. I have stuck my stencil down onto my cardstock with the repositionable glue again, just to make sure nothing goes through too much. And I'm going to do this in multiple different colours. So I've got the Colorology gilding waxes here. Again, 40% at the moment off of Colorology. And I'm just going to be placing this through the design. Now you need to do this quite thick because of course it needs to get into the stencil, but it looks absolutely beautiful when it's finished. So I'm going to do the centres of each of the flowers in this lovely gold, or sorry, bronze. This is the orangey bronze colour. Then I'm going to use the gold for the rest of the petals on each of the flowers. So that will be a bit like we did with the coloured paste, and just blending these out so there's a nice ombre effect. And now the flower's done, I'm going to do all the rest of the leaves with the silver. Now we've applied gilding wax to all the parts of the stencil, we can gently lift the stencil off and reveal the design, because of course this does look like a bit of a hot mess at the moment. Popping that into some hot soapy water so that can clean. And I love this because it is so dimensional, so beautiful. So I very gently heat that, and I've now got more of a glossy finish to the surface. The gilding wax is slightly melted, so it's given me a more rounded look to the edges. You can see how glossy and shiny that is. So now waiting for that to cool back down and set again. And I didn't actually film this bit, but if you've got a water-based spray or spritz, you can go over the top and the wax will completely resist it too. Now we saw the technique earlier where I used this particular stencil, and we did the Gina K technique where we actually added highlights to a design, but you can also add shadows too, and this is particularly good if you want to use something like texture paste, but the texture paste is a similar color to your paper and you want it to really stand out. So I'm just going to add some black ink to this. It can be black, it could be like a dark brown, something like that, just a dark shade. It's not going to be as drastic as it looks at the moment. I'm using Distress ink this time because I find Distress Oxide Black Soot is more like a charcoal. It's not a deep dark black. So once you've got all of that, you're going to want to again wipe down your stencil, and then I'm going to pick up the stencil and I'm going to move it in the same way as we did with the highlight technique. So hover it over where you just had it, and then with the shadow I prefer to move it slightly up and to the left so that the shadow is then underneath instead. Make sure that's even all the way round and stick that back down. Now this time, instead of ink or anything else going over the top, I'm going to put paste over the top. Depending on how thin or thick your paste is, you want to be careful about it seeping underneath. So if you can, of course, use your spray adhesive again, a repositionable one, just to make sure that all the edges stay down. This in particular is a crackle gel, so not only will it dry white, but you'll also get some crackles in the thicker areas when it dries, which will look really beautiful. So for this, I'm going to lift this up straight away. You can see how much dimension you've got just holding it like that. We move that around. At the moment, you've got the gloss on the gel because, of course, it's still drying. But you can see that dimension is so beautiful. So much like the effect where we added the highlight, this time we're adding the shadow. So this next technique is a lot of fun. So I've got a piece of heat resistant acetate. I'm going to place that down and I'm going to just spritz over the top with my stick and spray. This is my repositionable spray glue, and I'm going to do a light mist over the entire surface. Allow that to dry ever so slightly. So just give that a few seconds. Then I'm going to place a stencil onto the acetate, and this should hold it down pretty well. Then I'm going to take some embossing glaze. Now I prefer to use a glaze for this stage rather than a powder. So just to make sure that this is going to be a little bit see-through when it's dry. So I'm going to turn over my cardstock because I've got sticky on the back there, and obviously I don't want the powder sticking to that. And I'm going to, as long as that's all pressed down, I'm going to sprinkle my embossing glaze all over the stencil. Then again, gently lift that up and tap that. Now I have got myself a very soft brush, and I'm just going to brush over the stencil. This is going to leave you with powder in the gaps. Be very, very gentle. You don't want to be brushing that powder away. I'm just going to clear up this powder as well, and take your stencil off. Put your acetate down on the clean cardstock. If you've got any powder that you can see where you don't want it, you can try to brush that away, but it's actually quite difficult to get it away because it is fairly well stuck now. Luckily this is just at the edges. And then take a more solid embossing powder, so one that's not translucent like the glaze, and we're going to go all over the top. Now hopefully the glaze will mostly resist the powder from sticking where the triangles were, where the stencil was. Moment, tap that, and then I'm going to heat set that. And there you've got a piece of frosted acetate that's got partial transparency now because some of the embossing powder is blocking. Now you could use clear in these triangles. I quite like that we've got the touch of blue in there. It's very subtle, but it's a very, very pale blue. Of course, the design is slightly blurred just because that's what it is. The powder gets in places it shouldn't, but I just think that is really, really pretty, and it's a really fun effect, particularly if you're doing things like putting lights in the card. You could have those shining from underneath, things like that. And did you know you can pull liquid pearls through your stencils as well? Again, I've tapped this down, and I'm just going to add some of my liquid pearls to the top of my stencil here along the top. Now I'm not aiming for this to come all the way down to the bottom. I kind of want to distress the pattern as it comes down so it sort of fades out to nothing if possible. And then taking something, I've got a mixed media spatula here, but you can actually use something like a credit card, using the flat edge and just drag down. Now I've done the pink and green, I'm going to wipe the excess off so I don't mix the colours and go to the other half and do the purple and the orange. Beautiful. Now I'm going to take this off. I'm going to wash my stencil, allow that to dry. But look, that is absolutely beautiful. It's really subtle, really gorgeous, and you've got that shine. So this next technique is one called the Joseph's Coat technique. You've probably seen it before, but I'm definitely going to add this in because I think it's a really, really fun stencil technique that shouldn't be forgotten. I'm just going to ink through a stencil with various colour inks. And then once it's all inked, you want to remove your stencil, obviously put that to be cleaned, and on top of this we want to add a good layer of clear embossing powder. So I'm just heat setting this powder, and of course if you find that your inks have dried too much between inking through the stencil and then applying the embossing powder, you can go back over the ink with the clear ink, clear embossing ink if you want to, through the stencil of course, just over the design you've just done in the colour. Now in fact the Joseph's Coat technique is actually a bit different. You do ombre or colour blend into the entire background, then you use your stencil and you put embossing ink through that once the ink's dry. But I find this way just a bit quicker and easier because you don't have to wait for an entire panel to then dry before you can carry on. Then you want a darker colour. I prefer to use black, and I like the black soot in the Distress inks rather than oxides. I've said before about this being a darker, deeper colour black. You don't have to go with black if you prefer. It could just be any colour, but definitely the darker colours do work best. And we're just going to now blend this ink all in, so over all of the design. And don't worry, those colours will pop back out in a little while. And once you've completely covered with black ink, you can go ahead and you can buff off the excess ink from the heat embossing, and you'll reveal those lovely bright colours again. So there we go. So that's like the Joseph's Coat technique without the extra layers of ink underneath. Now you don't always have to use lots of different colours to get really lovely effects either. So if I just blend, or even maybe ombre, a panel of ink into this cardstock, let's go around about maybe halfway down. And I'm doing this reasonably lightly as well, but trying to keep it as even as possible. Pop this over the top, and then I'm going to go in with exactly the same colour. A little bit more ink on my brush this time, a little bit deeper, and I'm going to stencil through. And this time I'm going to concentrate on areas making sure a lot of the ink is getting through, and it's really nice and deep and dark this time. I am going to fade this out a little more, just like we have in the background. And there we have a beautiful ombre stenciled background. It looks like there's multiple colour inks used, just one ink, but it looks really, really pretty. For the next technique, I'm going to blend myself an inky background, again making sure I'm using water reactive inks. And this time I'm going to spritz my stencil, so making sure I use a clean side, just some water and a light mist, not too much, making sure I have covered the surface but there's not too many big blobs on there. This is going to be one of those kind of results that can look quite distressed. I'll pop that over the top there. I always, as always, do this on a larger piece of cardstock than I need for my project so I can cut down the area that I like the best. Using kitchen towel to absorb any excess water that might seep through and to also put some good pressure on the stencil. Lift the stencil up, and you can either leave it to air dry, you can blot up with the tissue, or you can heat set it. How pretty is that one? Now don't forget, of course, let's just flip this over to the other side. You have still now got wet ink on your stencil here, so another very light mist of water. and just press that down onto some scrap paper just to ensure that you don't get a really nice print. Sometimes you do, like I say, and sometimes you don't. You just never know, but it's worth transferring that ink anyway, just in case you come up with something really beautiful. So I've got a very subtle design there. Probably wouldn't use it on a card or anything, but like I say, it's definitely worth trying out. Now things are going to start getting even messier, so I'm going to tack down an alcohol inked background that I've already previously created onto my blending mat. This is an older blending mat, or I don't mind if alcohol inks get onto it. I'm going to put a stencil over the top, and again I'm just going to tack this in place, although because the blending mat is bumpy, this isn't going to sit nicely on there. In fact, you could even use a spray adhesive. I have decided to do that anyway, just a little bit, although chances are the next solution that I'm going to put on is just going to lift up anyway the stencil. So yeah, not much point doing this, but let's try. Okay, alcohol blending solution. We are going to try and create a pattern in the alcohol that we've already got. We're just going to spray this over, or squirt this over what we've already got here. The results are absolutely beautiful, so you don't actually need too much. I'm just making sure I'm getting it in each of the areas of the design, and we're just going to leave this to work and do its own thing. Now if you like grungy and distressed effects, that is going to be perfect for you, but you don't have to already have an ink blended background. So let's take a fresh piece of Yupo paper, or alcohol ink cardstock this is. I'm going to place down the same stencil as we just used, because this has got the sticky on the reverse. So I'm just going to press that down onto the cardstock. Now again, the alcohol ink will seep underneath. We're not going to avoid that happening, but that spray adhesive does help just a little. But we are just going to start adding some colour to this. Straight away you'll see it start to go underneath. Let's also add some blues as well. This will stain your surface of your stencil, so if you're worried about that, don't do this technique, but if you've got alcohol blending solution, you can clean your stencils with that. I'm just going to take a blending foam and just dab it into the pink and try to mix some of that ink around a little bit as well. Now lifting this up, again, you've got a very distressed look. I've got some more wet ink that was sitting under the stencil, so I'm definitely going to pick that up. But you've got a mixture of areas that have almost masked and areas that haven't completely masked. I love the effect. I think it is very subtle. You do need a bold stencil for this, but it's very, very different. Coming back to our flower stencil, this time we are going to be using clear embossing ink and pigment powders. Let's stick with the same two pigment powders. I absolutely love these. So what you're going to want to do is take some low-tack tape, keep your stencil down nice and tight if you can. I like to do the corners because these stencils are tag shapes, so that kind of just blocks off the square shape, and very often I'll cut these down anyway. Still, and I'm going to take my blending brush and my clear embossing ink. Now again, when I'm inking through a stencil, I want to make sure there's actually not too much on my brush, so I'm doing it very lightly with quite a small amount of ink on there. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. You can see the embossing ink on the design there. I'm going to work on a piece of paper for this next part, and I'm going to apply some powders. So I'm going to put some green powder down first of all in a couple of places, and these are going to be mostly over the leaves. And I'm going to get a very, very small soft brush, so extremely soft brush, and I'm just going to brush around the powders. Might need to put a bit more on. And then I'm going to do the same with the pink ones. Now the powders don't come out as bright, of course, as they would if they were mixed with water, so you are going to get a much more subtle colour. So I've got browns and greens in the leaves here, and on the flowers I've actually got a really nice mauve colour, although this is actually the magenta colour usually. where you want them. Absolutely beautiful. Now you can leave that to dry and there's a chance the powder might come off, but what I'd suggest you do instead is take a mister, a water that will mist very, very lightly, and just very gently spritz above that. That's it. Stop there. I'm not going to do any more. That water will then bind the powders to the cardstock. Allow that to dry, and that is you using your Colourpop powders with a stencil. Just a few more techniques left now. You can see from my fingers I'm getting very mucky, but I'm having so much fun exploring all these different techniques. Now the next one is a little bit different. So this is using acetate again. I'm going to be putting a stencil down onto the acetate and holding it still with some low tack tape again. And this time I want to use a medium that dries clear. So I have got clear texture paste. This is a transparent gloss. So with a palette knife, I'm going to run the transparent gloss through onto the acetate. I am using heat resistant acetate this time because I want to be able to warm this to help it dry a little bit quicker. I've actually got a tiny little bit of Colourpop powder there, the blue streak. We'll ignore that because we're actually going to be adding Colourpop powders in a moment. So when I say Colourpop powders, these are the brand at Craft Stash, the Colorology brand. That's what they're called. But you can also have mica powders, pigment powders. There's lots of different names for them. So now what I'm going to do is take my powders, as I say, and I'm just going to sprinkle these over the top. And I'm just going to lightly brush over the surface with my palette knife. So I'm not pushing into the stencil anymore. I'm just mixing that, the very surface of it, into the top layer that we've already done. Now that teal is really sort of overpowering the magenta, but that's fine. I just know another time to put a little bit less of the teal on, and then carefully lift off the stencil from your acetate. So now that's all cleaned up, I can now take my heat tool and gently warm this up. I'm going to do it from a distance, and I'm going to do it for a little while because I want that transparent gloss gel to dry and not bubble up. We can still see, which I'll show you in a moment when I hold it up, we can still see elements of the fuchsia pink in there, although we've got more of a purple colour going on. I will put this on top of some white cardstock in a moment. Now what I love about this is it is dimensional. It's hard to see on the camera, but it is, you have got that dimension to this. It looks like a piece of stained glass. You've got a slight transparency still to the gloss, and more so as it dries, but the colours are beautiful. They're holding really, really well. As I say, a piece of white cardstock, so hopefully you can see those colours on there. We have got the teal and the pink coming through. It's so beautiful. You can even see the shadow in the backgrounds there on the white cardstock. So if you were to raise this up into an aperture, you'd see that drop shadow on the back of the card. It's just so pretty. Like I say, if you look at this side, there we go. So there you can see the colours a bit more because it's still white underneath where it's not quite dry yet. But that will dry a little more clear as well. So like I say, a beautiful stained glass effect. Now this time working in a bit of a similar way, but this time we are working with a matte finish onto cardstock. So again, I'm going to use my clear or my transparent gloss. There we go. Gently lifting this off. Okay, and I've got a beautiful star or sunburst, whichever you want to call it. I can't remember what the original was called, whether it was a starburst or a sunburst, but I feel it was a starburst because it was with the In the Stars collection, and you can hopefully see that. So what I'm going to do this time, I'm going to bring some clear paper, nice dry paper, and this time we're going to have a different effect. So I'm going to take two bright colours just so you can see the difference, and I'm going to sprinkle these on. So pinches are much easier, or if you've got a small brush, or if you've got a small spatula. So for example, you could take a brush like this and tap this over where you want it. I find this takes a little while. It's a little bit fiddly, but we'll do that just for the centre bit. I'm going to fill in the red. There we go. I think that is pretty much covered. Now I'm quickly going to turn this over. It does make a mess, but you've got the red in the centre there. Let's clean this up, put this in the pot. Make sure all those red particles are gone off of, particularly off of my white cardstock. Then I'm going to come in with the blue. So the blue's going to go all over everything else basically. And you can do this with any colours. I'm choosing to use bright colours so you can clearly see. And then we've got our ombre. Now we've done this kind of before earlier, but this time I'm not going to heat set it. I'm not going to heat set it. I'm going to leave it. And what this does is instead of having glossy dots, you've got a matte finish. Now if you remember flocking powders we used to have years ago, dry embossing powder gives a kind of similar effect. It's not going to be fluffy, but it is going to give you a matte effect. So the last technique is one with shaving foam. You've probably seen this 100 times, to be honest. So I'm going to use Creative Craft products. These are the watercolour inks to colour this with. There's lots of different ways you can colour these. Honestly, re-inkers work really well as well. You don't want to mix it so much that you then don't have any pattern in it and it all becomes one block colour, so just be aware of that. So for this I'm going to use a handmade stencil. So I've got this backing sheet where I cut lots of circle dies, so I'm just going to cut into this, make that the correct sort of size. So I've got some big circles on there. I'm going to lay my stencil down and then of course my paper on top. So just press that down into the foam. You're going to get a little bit of lifting like so, and then you just want to put this aside to completely dry. Now what I prefer to do here is take the stencil out as well, because if you've used a paper one like me, this is going to be a really nice piece to keep. Let's pop that to the side. Lots of kitchen towel as well. And we're just going to get mucky fingers, but we're going to wipe this. As you can see, first of all, my stencil has got some lovely colours on it. I've placed a little bit of spray adhesive to the back of the stencil and I'm going to place this back down where it was. This is just going to prevent your shaving foam too much from spreading from those circle designs. Then you can take your kitchen towel and you can wipe away each of the circles. Now it may be that you get a little seep underneath your stencil. I keep calling it a stencil because that's what it is, albeit a handmade one, but hopefully the majority of the design is nice and clean, so you can do it with that technique as well. So there's 30 stencil techniques that I can think of to show you. If there's any more that you know of, please do put them in the comments so everybody else can see. Now I hope you've enjoyed this video and you've been inspired to get your stencils out and have a play. And if you've not done so before, I'd love it if you could subscribe to my channel. Take care everybody. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.